Welcome everyone to Nerd of the Rings. I've got another special guest with me today, Mr. Robert Aramayo. You know him as Elrond. Rob, thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Last season we got to see an Elrond, more the diplomat, kind as summer, as we know he's described. This season we get to see a bit more of his warrior side.
Yeah.
So what was this season more physically demanding, I would imagine?
Yeah, definitely more physically demanding. There's a lot of things that I had to do that I didn't really have any training in. You know what I mean? So it was like, it was sort of really into the fire really. But it was great for me, and it also is. It's the same with Elrond. He's not ready for this, or he's not up to task in the same way that Arondir or Galadriel would be. He's not. This is not his most comfortable arena. So I liked that because it was sort of like me and him going through the same thing. So yeah, it was really physically demanding, but. I lived next to the stunt gym essentially, and I'd just turn up at the door and be like, "Can I train?" The guys would be like, "Okay, come in." They teach me some amazing wushu or something like that. It was a lot of training, but as well, I didn't want Elrond to be, so proficient at fighting that I wanted it to be conceivable that this is a new thing for him. Not in an obvious sense, but hopefully less so. That it feels that he's still got a long way to go before you could call him like a superior warrior.
Right.
There are a lot of elves around, and most of them, I think, could kick his butt.
Yeah.
But that's good, because what he's got in abundance, I think, is his heart and his desire and, what's inside of him. That pushes him forward.
Yeah. Well, it kind of makes sense that this would be, you look at the timeline of his life, it kind of makes sense that the Siege of Eregion would be his first real battle.
That was one of the first conversations that we had with JD. One of the first things I asked JD was, because you could, War of Wrath and all that. You could argue that he was involved in that or not involved in that. You can make a choice. And so we made the choice really early on in the first season that he had nothing to do with that. Was nowhere near any of that. So. Although obviously his family was.
Right,
but in making that choice, this is his first real conflict and first real experience. So then you ask, like, what are the abilities that an elf is born with versus what training the various elves do and how does it help them, And I think Elrond spent a lot of time reading.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you spent a lot of time reading because you have quite the reputation among your fellow castmates of being a big fan of the books. At what point, in the process of getting involved with the show, or even if it was before the show, did you decide to kind of dive into the deep end of the Tolkien pool?
The show, I would say.
Yeah.
I would say it was the show because I made the choice that, like, I wanted to make the choice that, like, when I'm shooting it, when I'm working on it, that, if you were to ask anyone in Middle-earth a question about the history of Middle-earth, you'd probably ask Elrond,
Yeah.
And so I that quality in him, I wanted to try and take on myself as much as I could, and dive into it. But then I didn't expect to love it as much as I did, So it was like this wonderful gift, like exploring, like, and discovering the First Age and Gondolin and all that stuff. And then I became obsessed, and now I'm reading it all the time, And somebody was saying the other day, I was watching an interview with somebody who was saying, like, when you pick it up, it's as if you're reading it again for the first time. And it's so true.
Yeah.
It's just so true. Like, I forgot about that, or I never saw it that way. I was just reading anyway. Blah, blah, blah. So I love the material, and I love diving back in, and it's become a big part of my life now, which is great.
Yeah.
But I don't get into nerd-offs, which is, you know what I mean? Like, I think with Tolkien, you can easily get into a nerd-off.
100%.
I know more than you do.
Right.
Or like, actually, you're wrong about that because of this thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't get into that stuff because I think that's a dangerous territory.
It is, yeah. It's a slippery slope.
It is.
For sure.
It is, and I'd lose as well if I were to do it here.
Now, Charlie did mention, we just finished filming Charlie's interview, and he did mention that you were the president of, like, the Tolkien Club, and that he was, I think he said that he was the treasurer.
Yeah, we came up with all these positions. Yeah, it was really funny. It was really funny. We had so much fun. We'd all sit around the table and you know, we'd just read a bit and talk a bit. And all these memories are coming back to me, and we'd laugh, you know. But not just, you know, we'd read a lot of Christopher Tolkien stuff as well, and just talk about all kinds of elements of it and what it meant, and you know, because I think our minds, when we read, it's easy to think like, oh, that's an elf, that's what an elf does, that's what a dwarf does, because it's written and because it is that way. But then constantly when you're reading, you're thinking like, hang on a minute, what that elf just did felt very human to me. You know, and even though he knew that what he was about to do was going to ruin him, he still does it. Right. So it's so why? You know, that doesn't feel like this sort of ethereal wisdom that becomes synonymous with elves. So, exploring things like that and talking about things like that were all really fun, and like trying to round out the world, talking about, you know, invention in Middle-earth, magic potions in Middle-earth. How does magic function in Middle-earth? Like all of those things we would talk about, you know, and that would be really fun and funny as well. Yes, we'd laugh and joke, and we all did it at Charlie's house, I think.
That's awesome. Now, being, you know, the fan of the books that you are, you're well aware of, you know, connections that different characters have, relationships, how they connect, family trees and everything. Oliphant in the room here, you just kissed your mother-in-law.
Yeah, I did. yeah, he did do that. Well, obviously he doesn't know that at the time, and also it's sort of like, it's the most unexpected thing that I would imagine that he'd do. And so it sort of achieves his goal, you know, because it's not about kissing it, it's about something else.
Pest and brooch,
So I think that it's sort of like, it's a tactic, it's an out there tactic, but given where they are and who they're surrounded by, that would be my justification, I think.
So the question is, like, does Galadriel approve of the marriage because she knows that Elrond's a good kisser?
That's funny. That was a particularly interesting day. Yeah.
Now, the finale, we see elf survivors making their way to this valley. It's not named in the finale, but we know it's Rivendell. And this is obviously a really important location for Elrond.
Yes.
You know, it pretty much becomes synonymous with him. And is it exciting to get, you know, closer to this big location that is so
well, I don't really know how that is going to unfold, to be honest. I've got absolutely no idea, and the showrunners always have a way of surprising you. So I really don't know how that's gonna roll out. But if it does the way that you know you hope it does, it's an important moment. It's a special moment for everyone, but also for Middle Earth. And I really love the idea of seeing the last homely house. Really love the idea of seeing a place that begins as a defensive position. You know, not something that is like, and now I've discovered the city that will blah 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 blah. You know, but Rivendell's always been really important to me when thinking about Elrond, because all of the qualities and elements that go into the city of Rivendell, I tried to sort of synthesize into this elf. You know, because he doesn't really have anyone. He's sort of on his own at this point. So I wanted to think about like what you can learn from Rivendell in reverse that apply to who the elf is, you know. So, you know, we all know how important it is. I hope we get to explore it because it's really exciting and fun.
Now, obviously, season 2 just ended, but looking ahead, what excites you about the future of Elrond?
That probably, you know, that city and what he creates and what lies in front of him, you know. I think he really is genuinely one of the most fascinating characters that Tolkien ever wrote. You know, because he goes through so much, so many things happen to him, and he's required to adapt and into all different kinds of elements of his character. So the you know, exploring some of that, exploring Rivendell, you know, would be amazing. But also to see him grow into a real position of power and leadership. That would be awesome too.
How does Elrond still need to grow to become, how we see him in like the books in the Third Age?
Yeah.
So like from where he is now at the end of season 2, what do you look at how he needs to grow?
I think it's all there. Like when we were working on him in the first season, it was it was like sort of like supposed to be like all the gear and no idea that he spent like hundreds of years reading books and learning about all this stuff, but has never really put any of it into practice. And so the events that are unfolding in the story are all sort of like check markers, and like he's now putting things into practice, using it and making mistakes and learning from his mistakes and all that stuff. So it's like, it's growth really.
Yeah.
It's in him. I think he's just got to realize it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, last question. What's your favorite bit of Elrond trivia that hasn't been adapted?
That hasn't been adapted?
Yeah.
I really like his childhood, and I mean, I guess that's a boring thing to say because I could never do it. But if I were to make a movie about him, I think that whole period, with his mum and his dad and his brother and the choice, and that idea of, I'm going to say something else for 1 minute, but that idea of watching your brother grow old, I don't imagine that he didn't see him through that process, through those 500 and odd years or whatever it was, until he died, So I think that would be a really interesting thing for him to see someone who he was equal with, grow old.
Yeah.
And it's such a big element of Tolkien, like to speak about it all the time in his books, like that constant discussion between the Edain and the Eldar, like what is it like to be human and mortal, what is it like to be elvish and immortal, like that is such an interesting part of his writing. So I think that could be really interesting, but also like his wife, what happens there, all that sort of stuff. That's all. It's horrific. And is unadapted. So those would be very interesting stories, I think. But mainly the first one, because I think it would be. It's so Tolkien.
Yeah. Well, it's such a you bring up his wife, and he like you said, he goes through so much, and it's the reason why he's one of my absolute favorite characters, because then when you see him in the late Third Age, like he never gives up hope. Like he still puts Aragorn on the path that's like gonna make him lose his daughter and everything. And he's always like he's got this like unshakable, faith and drive to do the right thing.
And a real sense of preservation, which is so central to the elf. Like it's a big part of Rivendell and his character and who he is. Like it's, I think he's great.
Yeah. Well, Rob, thanks so much for joining me.
Cheers, pal.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
And we'll see you guys next time on Nerd of the Rings.